We were reading the line how Savitri's divine parts spontaneously elicited the illusions of the soul of those around. Whether their mind understood her or not, the soul saw, the soul felt, the soul knew the deity that dwelt in Savitri. Her will was puissant on their nature's acts. Savitri's will was powerful and exerted itself on the activities of their nature. It is easy for the higher will to exert itself on the activities of the soul, the Purusha, but difficult to act on nature. Her heart's inexhaustible sweetness lured their hearts, knowingly or unknowingly. Their hearts were attracted, tempted by the sweetness that was endlessly pouring from her heart, a being they loved whose bounds exceeded theirs. They were very conscious of their own limitations and bounds, but they knew her boundaries were far wider. She exceeded them in her boundlessness. So they loved her. Her measure they could not reach, but bore her touch. True enough, they could not reach her height, but they subjected themselves to her impact, to her touch, answering with the flowers answer to the sun. They gave themselves to her and asked no more. Just as the flower spontaneously blossoms, it turns in the direction of the sun. So many gave themselves to Savitri and did not ask anything of her except to be accepted. One greater than themselves, too wide for their ken. Their sight could not hold her. She was too wide. Their minds could not understand nor wholly know. They could know in a measure, in part, but not wholly. Their lives replied to hers, moved at her words, even though they could not comprehend her because of her vastness, though they could not know her because their minds could not understand her enough. Still, their lives spontaneously responded, replied, that is, answered to each vibration of hers and moved at her words. They didn't think anything, they just moved, did what she said. They felt a Godhead and obeyed a call, answered to her lead and did her work in the world. Their lives, their natures moved, compelled by hers, compelled by her life, compelled by her nature, as if the truth of their own larger selves put on an aspect of divinity. In her, they saw that their own higher self had put on that aspect of divinity. In other words, they saw her as an idealized form of their own aspiration. And why? Why did it put on the aspect of divinity? To exalt them to a pitch beyond their earths. Earths here means physical nature. Their physical nature could not go beyond a certain pitch, but by responding to her, they were lifted up beyond the reach of their physical nature. They felt a larger future meet their walk. She held their hands. She chose for them their paths. They were moved by her towards great unknown things. They did not know what they were, but they were moved because of her. Faith drew them. It was faith which compelled them, drew them towards the unknown things, and the joy to feel themselves hers, to belong to her, to have the sense of being possessed by her, that gave them a joy. They lived in her, they saw the world with her eyes. Everything they saw from her point of view, through her eyes. Some turned to her against their nature's bent. However, not all did it very spontaneously. Some had the difficulty of their nature, which was temperamentally different, but they compelled their nature to fall in line, and they turned to Savitri. Divided between wonder and revolt, so the suppressed nature asserts itself now and then. It shows signs of revolt, but their wonder, their faith, their marvel, and this revolt, they were divided, drawn by her charm and mastered by her will, possessed by her, her striving to possess, that is, possessed by her, and these people striving to possess her. Impatient subjects, they were impatient. They were not content to wait for the right hour. They were impatient to possess her. Their tied, longing hearts, hugging the bonds, close of which they most complained. In their daily life, these people complain bitterly that they are bound, they are tied to her. But inwardly, They were hugging those bonds which kept them closely tied to her. Murmured at a yoke they would have wept to lose. These sadhaks, they were always murmuring, what is this? It is a dictatorship. We have no freedom of will. Everything we have to do. But if there was the prospect of her withdrawing that, they would have wept. They were not prepared to lose what they called yoke. But outwardly, in their human movements, they murmured. All this is very familiar to all of us, many of us. Murmured at a yoke they would have wept to lose. And what's that yoke? The splendid yoke of her beauty and her love. Others pursued her with life's blind desires. There were others who followed her, pursued her to satisfy their own life's blind desires. They hoped for fulfillment by following her, by pleasing her. Others pursued her with life's blind desires and claiming all of her as their lonely own. Now, here is the mischief. Claiming all of her as their lonely own. She must belong only to them, not to others. That is what Sri Aurobindo used to point out, that each one wanted to possess her, possess singly and solely. Each one would resent and be angry with her if she were to give a kindly smile to another. It had to be exclusively to that person, otherwise it had no value. If somebody were to point out, Mother smiled so graciously at you today, some would say, but she smiled at others also. Now this, the claim of the vital to possess exclusively, he describes, claiming all of her as their lonely own, hasten to engross her sweetness meant for all. She has brought that sweetness. She is manifesting that sweetness for the whole universe, for all who come to her and who have not come to her. But these people hasten to engross, occupy, monopolize her sweetness. As earth claims light for its lone, separate need, there are so many planets, but earth claims light for its lone, separate need, demanding her for their sole jealous clasp. These people, they asked, they demanded her for their sole jealous clasp. They would share it with anybody else. They asked from her movements bounded like their own. They wanted her to function in small, limited movements and gestures which were similar to their own. And to their smallness craved a like response. The smallness of these humans, they wanted her response to correspond with that smallness. That is, she had to deny herself to others in order to please those who felt they had a claim on her love. Or they repined that she surpassed their grip. They tried to hold her, but she would escape. She would exceed their hold. And these people regretted, complained, and hoped to bind her close with longing scarves. Longing They had a longing for her, and they wanted to use that longing as a rope to tie her to themselves. Or finding her touch desired too strong to bear. If she were to give the desired touch, the touch or the response for which they asked, it was too strong to bear. They blamed her for a tyranny they loved. Inwardly they loved her tyranny, but outwardly they blamed her, shrank into themselves as from too bright a sun, just as we shrink from too dazzling a sun. They could not bear her power, her magnificence, and they shrank into their own smallness. Yet, hankered for the splendor they refused. The splendor that was at their doorstep, they refused because they would not submit to those conditions. And all the same, they hankered for it. They passionately desired it. Angrily enamored of her sweet, passionate ray, the weakness of the earth could hardly bear. An intense, strong ray of her consciousness was not born. Their physical nature, earth, could hardly bear that ray. They were weak. So they were angry that it should be tempered to their capacity. And still they were enamored, fond of it. They longed, but cried out at the touch desired, inapt to meet divinity so close. They were not disposed, ready, inclined to meet divinity so close. That far it is all right. But so close, with all the impurities, with all the cunning, with all the double nature, with all the reservations, each one was afraid that he would be found out, he would be exposed. She would know. So there were some people who deliberately kept out of close proximity, inapt to meet divinity so close, intolerant of a force they could not house. They could not contain a force, her force. And what they could not contain, they were intolerant of. Some drawn unwillingly by her divine sway, range, drew some, though they were unwilling. Apparently unwilling in their nature, but their soul called her. Some drawn unwillingly by her divine sway, endured it like a sweet but alien spell. Something foreign, it may be sweet, but it is not natural. Unable to mount to levels too sublime, being unable to rise to high and sublime levels, they yearned to draw her down to their earth. They sought passionately to draw her down to their own earth. It was somewhere in 1934-35, when mother was seriously ill, that in a letter that Sri Aurobindo wrote, he explains that she gave herself unreservedly, and instead of rising above themselves and receiving her, Each one tried to pull her down to his level. And the cumulative result was that she was bedridden for quite some weeks. I think it was 1934. They yearned to draw her down to their own earth, or forced to center round her their passionate lives, their vital passionate lives. If they had to organize around her, they hoped to bind to their hearts human needs, her glory and grace that had enslaved their souls. They tried and they hoped to use her glory and her grace for their little human needs, the glory and grace that had enslaved their souls, not their natures. Still, with all this, he says in the next para, but mid this world, these hearts that answered her call, even among those who answered her call, none could stand up her equal and her mate. None could be her equal or her companion. In vain she stooped to equal them with her heights. Too pure that air was for small souls to breathe. Clear? These comrade selves, to raise to her own wide breadths, her heart desired, her heart desired to raise these comrade selves, companion selves, those who had come to work with her, to raise to her own wide breadths. She desired, she tried, and filled with her own power. She wanted to fill their being with her own power, so that a diviner force might enter life, a breath of Godhead greaten human time. She wanted to raise them, she wanted to fill them with her own power, so that on this earth life a diviner force might enter, and a breath of Godhead greaten human time. Although she leaned down to their littleness, covering their lives with her strong, passionate hands, and knew by sympathy their needs and wants, she did not need to be told, either in letters or orally, what were their needs and wants. By sympathy she knew, and knew by sympathy their needs and wants, and dived in the shallow wave depths of their lives. She plunged into the depths of their being, however shallow they were, and met and shared their heartbeats of grief and joy. She encountered the heartbeats of grief and joy of her people, and bent to heal their sorrow and their pride. We can understand healing their sorrow, but their pride. This is the Sri Aurobindo's poetic touch, very profound. Heal their pride. That means in her presence their pride was wounded so often. Pride is a moment of ego. In front of that greatness, in front of that overwhelming glory, their little pride was hurt many times. And she bent to heal that pride, to raise them again, give them some self-respect. And bent to heal their sorrow and their pride, lavishing the might that was hers on her lone peak, on the height on which she lived in herself. She had a great might, And that she brought down and lavished here to lift to it their aspirations cry. She brought her might down in order that under its influence the cry of their aspiration may rise to it. And though she drew their souls into her vastitude and surrounded with the silence of her deeps, both vastness and depth, she surrounded them with and held as the great mother holds her own. Though she did all this, only her earthly surface bore their charge. Their charge, their contact was very superficial. It hardly touched her external physical surface. It never went within. It was never so pure, never so intense, and mixed its fire with their mortality. And the fire of her earthly surface, even there it had its own fire. It was mixed with their mortality. So all the interchange, all the give and take was on the earthly surface. Only her earthly surface bore their charge and mixed its fire with their mortality. Her greater self, lived soul, unclaimed within. Nobody aspired, nobody sought to reach her greater self. They were satisfied with having dealings with the surface self, surface exterior. Her greater self, lived soul, unclaimed within. Oftener, in dumb nature stir and peace, in nearness she could feel serenely one. In the mute stir and peace of nature, at times she could feel some nearness. The force in her drew earth's subhuman broods. The mighty force in her being attracted not so much the humans, but subhuman progeny. And they were, and to her spirit's large and free delight, she joined the ardent-hued, magnificent lives of animal and bird and flower and tree. Animal and bird and flower and tree, yet full of ardent, intense hue, color, their magnificent way of living. And she established a bridge. They were attracted. And she joined her free delight to these. They turned to her. They answered to her with a simple heart. There were no mental complications. There were no vital bargaining demands. Their hearts were simple and they responded. They answered to her with a simple heart.